So a few years ago, I lived in the Fenway neighborhood of Boston, and each day I found myself taking the long way home from work just so I could walk through the historic neighborhood of Back Bay. I was really captivated by the Gilded Age architecture of those large and historic homes. At night, the trees that line the street are lit up with lights, and you can see the insides of these homes. These historic brownstone buildings make for such an elegant home that former New England Patriots quarterback Tom Brady even lived in them at one point. Before the Victorian era, the entire neighborhood of Back Bay didn't exist actually, and it was simply a barren marshland that was filled to create a new fashionable neighborhood. It wasn't until this semester that I learned through my U.S. history class that the neighborhood of Back Bay was the product of the biggest landfill project in the history of Boston. Boston's decision to expand its metropolitan area is considered a great success because of carefully executed plans, hardworking laborers, and the people who preserve the area today. I'd like to begin by telling you why the city of Boston decided to take on the landfill project, followed by how it was constructed, and finally why the neighborhood is still considered one of the best preserved examples of Gilded Age architecture in the country. In order to understand why Boston filled a wetland to create a neighborhood, we're going to need to travel back to the beginning of the 20th century. In the late 1800s, America's cities were booming. As populations grew, many older American cities were resorting to expanding their boundaries by annexing neighboring towns and declaring the towns part of the city proper. Many notable cities, such as New York and Philadelphia, had expanded their metropolis by using the annex method, but Boston actually had a more unique idea. Before Back Bay made its transition into buildable land, it was simply just a bay. The bay was located on the Boston Harbor. The water in the bay was tidal, it rose and fell each day, and when it was on low tide, it exposed kind of like a wet marshland. During the mid-1800s, a lot of immigrants and new waves of immigration happened in Boston. A lot of the immigrants came from Ireland. They were fleeing the Great Potato Famine that left many people in their country starving. With the population exceeding the amount of available housing in Boston, the demand for new space increased. So the city hired a notable architect named Arthur Gilman to plan the neighborhood of Back Bay. And Gilman really drew inspiration from recent renovations that had been done to Paris. And that was done by an architect named George Eugene Haussmann. And Gilman adapted the parallel street-lined streets of Paris into the design of Back Bay, and streets like this had never been seen in the city of Boston before. Now that we have covered why the neighborhood of Back Bay was created, I'd like to delve into the logistics that went behind constructing the neighborhood. According to the National Geographic article, How Boston Made Itself Bigger, the Back Bay neighborhood is one of the most extensive areas of man-made land in all of Boston. In 1857, a massive project to fill the land began. Trains carrying gravel and other fill traveled from Needham, Massachusetts each day, and they had 25 separate trains going back and forth. Therefore, the trains were able to make 45 stops at the construction site every 45 minutes, which really was helpful in the speed of the production. The next step was to make sure that the structures in that area would be stable because they were being built on a wet land. Each structure in Back Bay is supported by dozens of 30 to 40 foot long wood pilings, and these pilings are similar to telephone poles. The pilings reach down through the landfill into a harder layer of clay. They also sit below a water table, which protects them from microbes that dryness would bring. And if it got dry and the microbes attached to the wood, they would decay, which would be very dangerous and jeopardize the structures on that building. The landfill project was completed in 1882, although it continued to extend in other areas. In 1890, what is now Kenmore Square was filled, and then in 1900, the entire Fenway neighborhood was created. And that is the area, if you have gone to Fenway Park, that is right around that area, so you'd be familiar with it. The big Citgo sign is Kenmore Square. Now that you're informed on the history of the neighborhood, I'd like to give you some updated facts about the neighborhood and how it's functioning present day. Although it is beautifully preserved, the neighborhood of Back Bay has shown its age at times. Over the years, residents in luxurious Back Bay homes have seen cracks on their walls and floors and even had difficulty opening doors out of nowhere. This is due to water levels dropping and rotting the pilings that look like telephone poles. It's a common problem due to the amount of property that was built in that area. However, there are solutions. In 1986, the city established the Groundwater Trust. The trust consists of professionals such as water engineers and other professionals who are able to monitor the levels of groundwater and help the residents restore and preserve their foundations. Despite its growing pains, Back Bay is still one of the most desirable neighborhoods in all of Boston. Not only do people reside in the well-preserved homes, but actually a lot of the homes are now commercial and storefront properties, such as Newbury Street. In addition, Back Bay is on the National Register of Historic Places, since it's an incredible example of architecture from the 1800s. The legislation also in Massachusetts in 1966 passed the Back Bay Architectural District, and this legislation ensures that any exterior changes made to the buildings in the district must be approved. Even though Back Bay was built in another century, the vision and the plans were executed so well that it has withstood the test of time. Now that I've presented you to the inspiration, history, and present-day events that have sustained this beloved Boston neighborhood, I hope you all consider visiting Back Bay this summer. Back Bay has always been a happy place for me, whether it's walking up Newbury Street or visiting restaurants, and I hope to visit my happy place again, and I hope all of you get to visit your happy places soon.